The sleek hull of the starship Celestial Dawn streaked through the dense atmosphere of Arctos 9, flames licking its underbelly as the vessel plummeted toward the planet's hostile surface. The ship had been a beacon of human ingenuity, a symbol of hope for colonizing the far reaches of space. But now, it was a falling star, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. 16-year-old Nadia Winters clung desperately to her seat, her knuckles white against the armrests. The emergency alarms screamed around her, a symphony of chaos and panic. The impact warnings flashed on every screen, casting a blood-red glow over the terrified faces of the passengers. They had been en route to the newly established outer colonies, but now everything had gone horribly wrong. "Brace for impact." Captain Harris's voice boomed through the intercom. The veteran pilot's usually steady tone was tinged with fear, something Nadia never thought she'd hear from him. He was supposed to be unshakable, a rock amidst the storm. But even rocks could crumble. Nadia's heart hammered in her chest as the Celestial Dawn shuddered violently. The ship's stabilizers had failed, and they were descending too fast. She heard the deafening roar of the engines as they strained against gravity, trying to slow the descent. But it was no use. They were going down. The last thing Nadia remembered was the bone-rattling impact as the ship smashed into the surface, the sound of metal screaming in protest, and then darkness. A world of silence. Nadia awoke to silence. For a moment, she thought she had died. Her ears were ringing, and everything felt distant, surreal. Slowly, she became aware of her surroundings, the acrid smell of burnt metal, the hiss of escaping gas, and the flickering lights that bathed the wreckage in a sickly yellow glow. Gritting her teeth, Nadia pushed herself up from the debris. Her entire body ached, but she was alive. The crash had torn the ship apart, twisted metal beams jutted out at odd angles, and broken glass littered the floor like deadly snowflakes. "Nadia!" She called out, her voice hoarse. But there was no response. No groans, no cries, nothing. Just the oppressive silence of a graveyard. She scrambled to her feet, wincing as pain shot through her leg. The emergency scanner on her wrist was still active, flashing a steady green light. It was designed to detect nearby life forms, but the screen showed only one blinking dot, her own. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She was alone. Fighting back a surge of panic, Nadia forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to break down now. Survival was the priority. Taking stock of her surroundings, she noticed a faint glow coming from a half-buried storage locker. The emergency backup system had managed to keep it powered. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside, she found a survival backpack packed with essentials, a compact energy knife, water filtration tablets, a few nutrient bars, and a thin thermal blanket. Nadia thanked whatever cosmic luck had spared her and slung the backpack over her shoulder. She couldn't stay near the wreckage for long. The ship's fuel cells were leaking, and there was a very real risk of an explosion. Stepping out of the shattered remains of the ship, Nadia squinted against the harsh, reddish light of Arctos 9's twin suns. The landscape that greeted her was nothing like the lush, green colonies she had read about. Instead, it was a hellish wasteland of jagged rocks, twisted trees, and crimson skies that seemed to swallow the light whole. The air was thick, laced with a bitter, metallic tang that stung her throat. She checked her wristcom again, trying to send out a distress signal, but all she got was static. The planet's atmosphere must have been interfering with the communication channels. Her only hope now was to find a secure location and wait for a rescue that might never come. The dangers of Arctos 9. Nadia moved quickly, putting distance between herself and the crash site. The rocky terrain was uneven and treacherous, forcing her to watch every step. Strange, alien plants with needle-like thorns jutted from the ground, and every now and then, she would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eyeshadows darting between the rocks. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination or something more sinister. Her first real encounter with Arctos 9's wildlife came sooner than she expected. As she climbed over a ridge, she nearly stumbled into a nest of serpentine creatures, their bodies coiled like springs, their eyes gleaming like polished onyx. They hissed in unison, exposing needle-sharp fangs. Nadia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she reached for her energy knife, its blade humming softly as she powered it up. But instead of attacking, the creatures retreated into the shadows, as if deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. Breathing a sigh of relief, Nadia hurried on. It was clear that every moment spent exposed on the surface was a risk. She needed to find shelter, and fast. The twin suns were sinking lower, and the temperature was already dropping. From the briefing she'd had on the Celestial Dawn, she remembered one key detail: the nights on Arctos 9 were deadly cold, and that was when the real predators came out to hunt. A glimmer of hope. Hours later, Nadia's muscles screamed in protest as she climbed the craggy hillside. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get away from the crash site. Just as she was about to give in to exhaustion, she spotted a cluster of rocks that formed a shallow cave. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She ducked inside and collapsed against the cool stone wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The cave was dark, but at least it was dry and offered some protection from the elements. Using her emergency fire starter, she managed to get a small flame going with some dried alien plant matter she had collected on the way. As the fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls, Nadia allowed herself a moment to catch her breath. She pulled out one of the nutrient bars from her pack and nibbled on it, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the crew, her friends, her mentors. Were they really all gone? The thought sent a wave of loneliness crashing over her. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed through the cave. Nadia froze, her senses on high alert. It was a faint clicking noise, like claws tapping against stone. She turned, squinting into the darkness beyond the firelight. For a moment, she thought she saw a pair of glowing green eyes watching her, but when she blinked, they were gone. "Just my imagination," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew better. Arctos 9 was far from uninhabited, and she was far from alone. As the fire crackled and the winds howled outside the cave, Nadia settled in for her first night on Arctos 9. The reality of her situation was sinking in. The ship was gone, the crew was lost, and no one knew where she was. But she was alive. And that was a start. In the morning, she would begin her search for food, water, and most importantly, hope. Dawn broke over the desolate landscape of Arctos 9, the planet's twin suns casting an eerie crimson light across the jagged terrain. Nadia Winters blinked awake, her eyes crusted from exhaustion. For a brief moment, she hoped it had all been a nightmare, that she would open her eyes to find herself back on the Celestial Dawn, surrounded by her friends. But the cold, rocky floor of the cave beneath her and the acrid tang of alien air in her lungs quickly reminded her that she was stranded on a hostile world. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, Nadia sat up and assessed her surroundings. The small fire she had managed to start the night before had long since burned out, leaving behind only a faint warmth that did little to stave off the planet's chill. The shelter of the cave had provided some protection from the biting cold, but now she needed to move. Staying in one place for too long was a death sentence. With a sigh, she shouldered her survival backpack, checked her energy knife, and stepped out into the harsh light of the rising suns. Today, she needed to find water and food. Her nutrient bars were running low, and she had no idea how long she would be stuck on this planet. The crash site was a distant memory now, just a smoldering wreck on the horizon. Nadia had walked for hours the previous day, trying to put as much distance between herself and the ruins of the Celestial Dawn. If the fuel cells exploded or worse, attracted predators, she didn't want to be anywhere near it. Into the heart of the jungle, the landscape gradually shifted as Nadia trekked further from the crash site. The barren, rocky plains gave way to a dense, alien jungle. The air was thick with humidity, making it difficult to breathe, and every surface was coated in a slick, oily residue. The towering trees were unlike anything she had ever seen, their bark blackened and twisted, their leaves a sickly shade of purple that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the sunlight. Nadia's scanner beeped softly on her wrist, alerting her to movement nearby. She paused, crouching low behind a rock, her heart pounding. The scanner detected faint life signs ahead, but they were erratic, pulsing and disappearing like flickering lights. She wasn't sure if that meant the creatures were moving quickly or if the scanner was malfunctioning in the dense jungle. She carefully peeked over the rock and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Just beyond the tree line was a small herd of creatures that resembled a cross between deer and reptiles. They had scaly hides that shimmered in the crimson light and elongated snouts lined with razor-sharp teeth. Despite their intimidating appearance, they seemed to be grazing on the strange purple foliage, paying her no mind. Quietly, Nadia edged away. These creatures didn't seem aggressive, but she wasn't about to test her luck. She had bigger problems to deal with, like finding water. A precious resource after hours of pushing through the thick underbrush, Nadia's throat was parched, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth. She was beginning to feel lightheaded when she heard the faint trickle of water. Her heart leapt. She pushed through the dense foliage, branches scratching at her exposed skin, until she stumbled upon a small stream winding its way through the jungle floor. Dropping to her knees, Nadia used her water filtration straw to take a cautious sip. The water tasted metallic, but it was safe enough to drink. As she filled her canteen, she allowed herself a moment of relief. At least now she wouldn't die of thirst. But her moment of reprieve was short-lived. As she straightened up, she heard a low, guttural growl from behind her. Nadia spun around, her knife at the ready. Emerging from the shadows was a creature that looked like a cross between a wolf and a lizard. Its eyes glowed an unnatural green, and its fangs dripped with a thick, viscous saliva. For a tense moment, neither Nadia nor the creature moved. Then, with a snarl, it lunged. Nadia barely managed to dodge to the side, her heart racing as she slashed out with her energy knife. The blade left a searing blue trail in the air, but the creature was too quick, leaping back before the knife could connect. Realizing she was outmatched, Nadia did the only thing she could think of: she ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the jungle, the sound of the creature crashing through the underbrush behind her. She zigzagged between trees, trying to lose her pursuer, but it was fast, much faster than any predator she had ever encountered on Earth. Just as she began to lose hope, the ground beneath her gave way. Nadia fell, tumbling down a steep embankment and landing hard on her side. Gasping for breath, she struggled to her feet, expecting the creature to pounce at any moment. But when she looked up, she saw that it had stopped at the edge of the embankment, its eyes narrowed. It let out a frustrated growl before turning and slinking back into the shadows. Nadia leaned against a tree, her chest heaving. Whatever that thing was, it clearly had its territory, and she had just crossed the boundary. For now, she was safe, but only just. A companion in the dark. As the twin suns dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the jungle floor, Nadia realized she needed to find shelter again. The temperature would drop sharply once night fell, and she didn't want to be caught out in the open with those predators roaming about. After some searching, she found a small overhang formed by a tangle of massive tree roots. It wasn't much, but it would provide some cover. She gathered some dried leaves and wood, using her fire starter to ignite a small flame. The flickering light cast eerie shadows, but it also brought a sense of comfort. As she settled in, gnawing on the last of her nutrient bars, Nadia heard a soft rustle nearby. She tensed, reaching for her knife. But instead of a predator, she saw a familiar face, those glowing green eyes from the previous night. It was the cub she had seen near the crash site, its fur a mottled pattern of dark greens and browns that blended perfectly with the jungle. The creature tilted its head, watching her curiously. Nadia cautiously extended a piece of dried food toward it, and to her surprise, the cub edged closer, sniffing the offering before snatching it up with a quick flick of its tongue. "Well," she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. Looks like we're both just trying to survive, huh? The cub made a soft, chirping sound in response, settling down just outside the glow of the fire. Nadia didn't know why it was following her, but she was grateful for the company. As strange as it was, the little creature's presence made her feel less alone. That night, as she huddled close to the fire, Nadia found herself drifting off to sleep with a newfound sense of hope. The jungle was still filled with dangers, but she had water, a place to rest, and dare she think it a companion. Tomorrow, she would continue searching for resources, maybe even something that could help her send a signal off this cursed planet. But for now, she was alive. And that, she decided, was enough. Morning came with a dull crimson glow as Arctos 9's twin suns rose over the alien jungle. Nadia woke with a start, her muscles stiff and aching from the previous day's exertions. Beside her, the cub, her unexpected companion, stirred, its green eyes blinking in the low light. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the simple comfort of not being alone. But survival was a relentless taskmaster, and today, she had more work to do. With a sigh, she stretched and packed her belongings. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the crash, and the reality of her situation was becoming more grim by the day. The nutrient bars she had salvaged from the wreck were nearly gone, and her water supply wouldn't last much longer. If she was going to survive, she needed a more permanent shelter and a steady source of food. Taking one last look at the makeshift camp she had spent the night in, Nadia set off deeper into the jungle, the cub trailing behind her. It was clear to her now that the creature had adopted her, or perhaps it was the other way around. Either way, she found comfort in its silent presence. Finding the perfect spot after several hours of navigating the dense jungle, Nadia stumbled upon a promising location, a rocky outcrop that jutted out from a cliffside, overlooking a small, shimmering stream below. The cliff would provide natural protection from wind and predators on one side, and the stream was close enough to serve as a reliable source of water. "This will do," she muttered to herself, a hint of determination in her voice. The cub chirped as if in agreement. Nadia surveyed the area carefully, assessing what she had to work with. The trees here were massive, their twisted roots snaking through the rocky ground like veins. Their bark was tough, almost like rubber, and the branches were as thick as her arm. It wouldn't be easy, but she had the tools and, more importantly, the will. She started by gathering branches and thick vines from the surrounding trees. Using her energy knife, she trimmed them into manageable pieces and lashed them together with the strong, fibrous vines she had collected. Sweat dripped down her face as she worked, her muscles burning with the effort, but she pressed on. This was her only chance at creating a safe haven. As she worked, she kept an eye on her surroundings. The jungle was never truly quiet. The air was filled with the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant creatures, and the occasional clicking noise that sent shivers down her spine. But the cub, which she had started calling Rex, seemed to have a keen sense for danger. Whenever it perked its ears and growled softly, Nadia would stop and listen, waiting until the threat had passed before resuming her work. Constructing the shelter by midday, the framework of her shelter began to take shape. Using sturdy branches for the walls and the resilient leaves of the alien trees as roofing, Nadia crafted a basic structure that would protect her from the acidic rain that occasionally lashed the planet. She reinforced it with rocks from the cliffside, wedging them into place to weigh down the walls and prevent the wind from tearing it apart. As she worked, Nadia couldn't help but marvel at how far she had come in such a short time. Back on Earth, she had been a city kid, a teenager who spent more time worrying about exams and social media than survival skills. But here, on this hostile planet, she was learning to adapt. She was discovering strengths she never knew she had. The suns were beginning to set by the time she finished the roof. Exhausted but triumphant, Nadia took a step back to admire her work. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was hers. A small sanctuary amidst the chaos of Arctos 9. Rex bounded up to her side, chirping excitedly. Nadia couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, I know. It's not much, but it's home. Foraging for supplies. With the shelter complete, the next task was to secure a steady food source. Nadia had seen plenty of strange fruits and plants during her trek through the jungle, but she was wary. One wrong bite could be fatal on a planet like this. Fortunately, her wristcom had a basic database of known alien flora, and she used it to scan anything that seemed edible. She discovered a small grove of plants with bulbous, yellow fruit that her scanner identified as non-toxic. The fruits were tough to crack open, but inside was a soft, fleshy pulp that tasted faintly of citrus. Encouraged by the find, Nadia gathered as many as she could carry and brought them back to her shelter. While she foraged, Rex stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day. The cub was more than just a pet, it was a second set of eyes, a warning system, and a companion in this desolate world. As night fell, Nadia made a small fire using dried plant matter. The light flickered across the rough walls of her shelter, casting long shadows that danced with the swaying trees outside. She sat beside the fire, sharing a piece of the fruit with Rex, who devoured it eagerly. For the first time since the crash, she felt a flicker of hope. She had a shelter, food, and water. Maybe, just maybe, she could survive long enough to be found. Setting traps and defenses. The next few days were spent fortifying her little sanctuary. Nadia knew that the jungle's more dangerous predators would eventually sniff her out, especially with the scent of food. Using parts she salvaged from her survival kit, she crafted makeshift traps to guard the perimeter. She also experimented with some of the bioluminescent plants she had discovered. By carefully extracting their glowing sap, she created a series of light markers that she hung around the perimeter of her shelter. At night, they cast an eerie green glow that kept some of the more timid creatures at bay. But the true test came one stormy night. As the winds howled and acid rain battered her shelter, Nadia heard a low growl from the darkness outside. Rex bristled, letting out a soft warning chirp. Nadia grabbed her energy knife, her heart pounding. Peering out into the night, she saw the glowing eyes of a predator lurking just beyond the light markers. It was one of the wolf lizard creatures she had seen near the stream, a fully grown one, much larger than the cub she had befriended. It prowled back and forth, testing the boundaries of her defenses. The creature lunged forward, but one of her traps snapped shut, a burst of electrical energy surging through its body. With a pained yelp, it retreated into the darkness, leaving Nadia and Rex alone once more. "Looks like that worked," Nadia muttered, sinking back against the wall in relief. Rex chirped and nuzzled her leg, as if to say, "I told you so." A beacon of hope. Days turned into weeks, and Nadia slowly but surely adapted to her new life. She had developed a routine gathering food, maintaining her shelter, and exploring further into the jungle to learn more about this strange world. Yet, a part of her never gave up hope of being rescued. One morning, while climbing to the top of the cliff to check the terrain, Nadia's wristcom crackled to life. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably a human signal. Heart racing, she adjusted the settings, trying to pinpoint the source. The signal was coming from several miles away, deep in the uncharted jungle. For the first time in weeks, Nadia's heart filled with hope. But getting there would mean leaving the safety of her shelter and venturing into unknown territory alone, with only Rex by her side. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. "I survived this long," she said, looking down at Rex. "What's a few more miles?" With her gear packed, she set off into the jungle once more. This time, she wasn't just surviving. The crimson sky above Arctos 9 darkened ominously as the twin suns dipped toward the horizon. Nadia Winters stood at the top of the cliff she had called home for the past few weeks, her wristcom crackling with intermittent bursts of static. Somewhere beyond the dense jungle canopy, a human distress signal was reaching out, a faint glimmer of hope that there were others like her who had survived the crash. Nadia's heart raced as she adjusted the settings on her wristcom, trying to narrow down the signal's source. It was faint, but it was unmistakably human. Could there really be someone else out there, stranded just like her? A cold gust of wind whipped through the jungle, sending leaves swirling into the air. The once still atmosphere seemed to shift, the temperature dropping rapidly. Rex, her ever-faithful cub companion, let out a low growl, the fur along his back bristling. Nadia turned her gaze to the sky, her stomach sinking. The thick, churning clouds overhead were darker than usual, tinged with a sickly green glow that filled her with dread. She had seen storms on Arctos 9 before, but nothing like this. This was different. This was dangerous. "We need to move, Rex," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "This storm is going to be bad. But we have to reach that signal before it's too late." With a quick glance at her makeshift shelter, Nadia made a decision. She couldn't risk losing this opportunity to find another survivor, even if it meant abandoning the safety she had worked so hard to build. She grabbed her backpack, filled it with essential supplies, and slung it over her shoulder. Rex let out a worried chirp, but Nadia gave him a reassuring pat. "Let's go," she said. Together, they plunged into the jungle as the first droplets of corrosive rain began to fall. A race against the storm, the wind howled through the jungle like a wounded beast, tearing at the trees and sending branches crashing to the ground. The air was thick with the sharp, acrid scent of the approaching acid rain. Nadia moved as quickly as she could, her feet slipping on the wet, uneven ground. Every few seconds, she glanced at her wristcom, trying to keep the signal's faint pulse in range. Rex darted ahead, his keen senses guiding them through the chaotic landscape. His fur glowed faintly in the eerie light, a comforting beacon in the encroaching darkness. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and Nadia's heart sank as she realized they were running out of time. Just as the rain began to intensify, stinging her exposed skin, Nadia spotted something through the trees, a flash of silver. She pushed through the dense underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and emerged into a small clearing. There, partially hidden by the foliage, was a battered escape pod, its exterior scorched and covered in vines. The wristcom beeped urgently. This was at the source of the signal. The survivor Nadia approached the escape pod cautiously, her knife at the ready. The hatch was partially open, creaking with every gust of wind. Inside, she could make out a figure slumped over the controls, unmoving. For a moment, fear seized her. What if she was too late? Steeling herself, she climbed into the pod. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of burnt electronics. The survivor was a boy, around her age, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His uniform was torn, and there was a nasty gash on his forehead. "Hey," Nadia called, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but then widened in shock when he saw her. Where am I?" he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're on Arctos 9, Nadia replied, her tone gentle but urgent. "I'm Nadia. We need to get out of here. This storm is about to get worse." The boy's gaze darted around, panic setting in. I can't move. My leg." He winced in pain, and Nadia quickly assessed his injury. His leg was pinned awkwardly between the console and the seat. "Hang in there," she said, taking out her energy knife. With precise cuts, she freed his leg, using strips from her thermal blanket to fashion a makeshift splint. "We have to move, or we're both going to die here." The boy nodded weakly. With Nadia's help, he managed to hobble out of the pod. She draped his arm over her shoulders, supporting most of his weight. Rex circled them, growling at the storm that now roared around them, lightning flashing in the green-tinged sky. "What's your name?" Nadia asked as they struggled through the lashing wind. "Jonas." "Jonas Reed," he answered, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Thank you for finding me." The long night. The journey back to Nadia's shelter was a grueling ordeal. The storm had fully unleashed its fury, turning the jungle into a swirling nightmare of wind, acid rain, and lightning strikes. By the time they reached the rocky overhang, Nadia's clothes were soaked through, and Jonas was barely conscious. "Hold on," she urged as they staggered into the shelter. She lowered him gently onto the ground, grabbing her medical kit to treat the wound on his leg. Outside, the storm raged, the sound of rain like needles against the rocky walls. Rex, who had been pacing anxiously, finally settled down beside Jonas, his eyes glowing softly in the dim light. The boy stared at the creature in disbelief. "What is that?" he asked, his voice slurred with exhaustion. "A friend," Nadia replied with a tired smile. "He's been keeping me company since the crash." Once Jonas was bandaged up, Nadia offered him one of her precious remaining nutrient bars and a sip of water. "You need to eat," she insisted. "You've lost a lot of blood." As the storm howled outside, the two of them huddled together for warmth. Jonas' eyes were full of questions, but he was too weak to ask. Nadia could see the fear and confusion in his gaze. It was the same fear she had felt when she first realized she was stranded here. "We'll get through this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We have to." A new beginning. The storm finally began to die down just before dawn. The world outside was unrecognizable, a landscape of fallen trees, eroded cliffs, and a thick layer of steaming acid pooling in the lowlands. But the shelter had held, and Nadia allowed herself a moment of relief. Jonas stirred, his face no longer as pale as the night before. "I don't know how you've survived here alone," he said, wincing as he tried to sit up. "I wasn't alone," Nadia replied, giving Rex a grateful look. "And now, neither are you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Nadia allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared to before: hope. They were two survivors on a hostile planet, but together, they had a better chance of making it through. "Jonas," she said, her voice resolute, "we're not just going to survive. We're going to find a way off this rock. There has to be another escape pod, or a beacon we can fix. We just need to hold on." Jonas gave her a weak smile. "I think I can manage that." And so, as the twin suns of Arctos 9 began to rise once more, casting their red light over the battered landscape, Nadia and Jonas prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. With the storm behind them and a new ally by her side, Nadia was no longer just a girl trying to survive. Now, she was a leader, a beacon of hope on a planet that had tried to break her. And together, they would conquer whatever came next.